Anna Sauerbrey heads the opinion pages of Der Tagesspiegel and Tagesspiegel Causa, her newspaper's online forum. She writes essays and commentary for her own newspaper and also a monthly column on German politics and culture for the New York Times. Anna studied history, political science, and journalism in Mainz and Bordeaux. She started her career as a journalist as an intern at the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung and at ZDF, among others, and was also a freelancer for the Mainzer Rhein Zeitung for several years. In 2009, Anna Sauerbrey completed her traineeship at the Tagesspiegel and became a staff member in its opinion and editorial department. In 2013, she was an Arthur F. Burns Fellow at the Philadelphia Inquirer, and in 2018, she was awarded an Anna Marie and Stephen Kellen Fellowship by the ACG to conduct research on the role of religion in American politics. Anna, thank you so much for joining us from Berlin.
Thank you so much for having me, and sorry for the difficulties with the audio, but I believe you can hear me now.
It sounds perfect, so thanks again. And ACG Young Leader alumnus Sewell Chan sits on the editorial board and oversees the op-ed and Sunday opinion pages of the LA Times. He was named to this position in April of 2020. Previously, he served as a deputy managing editor. He also supervised the homepage and audience engagement teams and helped reorganize them into an integrated news desk. Before joining the LA Times in September of 2018, he spent 14 years at the New York Times, where he was a Metro reporter, Washington correspondent, deputy op-ed editor, and international news editor. He began his career in July of 2000 as a reporter at the Washington Post, reporting on local government, education, and social services. A native New Yorker, Sewell grew up in an immigrant family and was the first in his family to finish college. Sewell, thanks so much for being with us as well.
Thank you, Stephen.
So before we get started, we'd just like to remind everybody that ACG and 1014 are both independent, nonpartisan organizations. The views expressed during this conversation are those of the two experts. Also, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the chat function on Zoom or send me an email using sokol@acgusa.org, and we'll do our best to integrate your questions into the conversation.
Let's get started. Anna and Sewell, you're both responsible for the opinion pages of your respective papers. So just in general, how has the pandemic with its lockdown and social distancing changed how you work? Anna, do you want to start?
Please go ahead.
Anna, do you want to go ahead and start?
Yes, I can start. Well, first, in a very practical sense, because we have introduced home office work in pretty much all of the editorial staff of the Tagesspiegel. So the way you can see me now, working from my bedroom slash working room in my apartment is the way I've been working since mid-March, and so is everybody else at the Tagesspiegel. So we've taken all of our editorial staff meetings online to Zoom, or we work with Outlook Teams. We meet there twice a day to plan both the online content and the newspaper. We work with all the content management systems from at home, and of course we've taken many of the conversations we have with experts and sources to the digital realm. So that's in a very practical sense, and then maybe more in a sense of ideas or what work feels like. It feels like it makes a lot more sense because we get a lot of positive feedback. We feel that people really crave the information that we were able to provide, particularly on the height of the crisis, which in Germany was around mid-March until mid-April. So we had a lot of feedback from our readers, a lot more than we usually do, and a lot more positive feedback, which of course was a great motivation for us for our work.
And sorry, I was on mute. Sarah, how about you? Do you have this experience, or how does the work look for you?
For me, Katja?
Yes.
Yeah, my experiences have been quite similar actually to those of Anna. We ceased working in our headquarters on Friday, March 13th, and we're an organization of about 500 journalists in total, so that really required considerable workarounds. The first few weeks especially were very intense because people had to test all their home computing setups. In some cases, we allowed people to take their computers from work, just anything to make their lives easier, especially at the beginning. We were not certain how long this would last. Unfortunately, with the second wave, or in some ways, the continuation of the first wave, especially here in California, where we're basically back down on lockdown, it really could be several more months before we can meet again. So how have we adapted to that? Well, my team, the editorial board, meets 3 times a week via Zoom. We also bring in guests traditionally, usually at least once a week, to meet with our editorial board and discuss important issues. Last week, we had Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey and Congresswoman Karen Bass of California, who is reputedly on the short list of potential vice presidential nominees for Mr. Biden. So we engaged in a very detailed discussion of police reform. And you know, it's a change for all of us. A funny story: Congresswoman Bass had behind her the federal flag of the United States, the California flag, and the congressional decal. So I said to her at the beginning, "Congresswoman, I assume you're calling from your district office in Los Angeles," and she said, "No, my dining room." Where she had that set up. So we've had to adapt. You know, fortunately, as a page of kind of opinions, ideas, and debates, it hasn't been so hard for us. You know, we're doing everything by Zoom call. It's hard not to be able to meet with your team. I would say on the news side of our business, that's where you've had some greater difficulty. I think a lot of the news, well, first of all, we have sent some news reporters to the field. And in Minneapolis, Minnesota, 2 of our journalists, a reporter and a photojournalist, actually were injured, unfortunately, during the reactions to the George Floyd protests. So that's not directly related to the pandemic, but of course, this has been really a heightened time of tension, a time of great challenge to be a journalist. There have been more attacks online and elsewhere, and of course, accusations of fake news. Being here in California and being less focused on kind of partisan Washington news, I think we have been spared some of that, but we have been really trying to protect our staff, mindful that this is a very stressful time. And part of that has also involved in providing training in resilience and resilience and grit and overcoming trauma, which I think it's important for journalists to acknowledge, you know, occurs at a time of great hardship like this one.
Can I just have a follow-on question? So you just made the difference between the news reporting and then the opinion page, and you explained how the news reporting has changed, but the opinion pieces you publish, have they changed slightly too? Also, maybe in light of a special responsibility as a journalist, you feel?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I should have answered that. That's a great question. Yeah, nearly everything we publish right now is in some ways about the pandemic. You know, we have a specialist editorial writer specializing in science. We have another editorial writer specializing in higher education. We've tried to look sector by sector at the government's response and to assess whether that response is appropriate. If I may give an example, yesterday Los Angeles, which is the 2nd largest school district in the whole nation, decided that there would be no in-person classroom instruction in the fall. And we actually had a very spirited debate as an editorial board because the trade-offs are so profound. The hardship caused for working families is so immense. And of course, the American Academy of Pediatrics really warned that the impact of not having children in the classroom could really have some developmental and other long-term impacts for quite a while. We had to counterbalance that with the public health urgency and the school superintendent's findings that the risk of kind of uncontrolled spread, you know, obviously the children thankfully have not had a tendency to get sick, but they could be carriers of the disease. So that was a very controversial area where we really had to, we ultimately decided to support the superintendent, but we said it was a very agonizing and difficult decision and one that may have to be reopened. But I would say nearly, it's been, I'm sure Anna has seen this as well, there's just been a flood of interest in current events right now as people try to make sense of these turbulent times. So we have responded to that by really focusing the vast majority of our opinion coverage probably right now is either on the public health crisis or on the issues of racial unrest and racial injustice that have been raised. And then of course, finally, issues concerning the coming federal election.
Right. And Anna, how about you at the Tagesspiegel? I mean, you said earlier that people crave information. Have you changed the opinion pieces too, the same way that Sewell just explained?
I hear you quite the audio is quite poor, but I believe I got the sense of the question. Steve, maybe you could repeat that because I can hear you better.
So Katja was just asking if your experiences at the Tagesspiegel have been similar to what Sewell was describing at the LA Times in terms of whether the focus of some of the opinion pieces and editorials is evolving as well.
Yes, I think that for about 2 months, particularly in the months of March and April when the crisis was at its height in Germany, we covered hardly anything but the corona pandemic, both in the news section as well as in the opinion section. So the question that Sewell has raised was a very big question in Germany too, very contested. Should children be in school? What's the greater harm, having them in the school as potential spreaders of the virus, or having them at home without school? And of course, we now see we've had we've had quite a few studies by now, but there was a large controversy on that for most of the time. It's still not quite sure, I believe, how children and how the effect of schools on reining in the pandemics are, and the controversy certainly continues. We now have the summer break in Germany, but I'm sure we will have it back on the table in the newspaper once we go towards the end of the summer break, which is mid-August in Germany. And then, of course, I think that the controversy was less fervent than in the United States because of the more serene political reaction to it in Germany. At first, there was a very broad consensus among all the political parties in Germany, maybe with the exception of the Alternative for Germany, a right-wing populist party. And so there was quite little debate on whether the measures the German government took were right or not. That changed, I think, when the numbers of the infections went down. Then there was some debate, which of course was reflected on the opinion pages in my newspaper too, on how quickly we should reopen the country, and also like what groups to cater to first in the sense of who's first to get economic aid. Should it be families? Should it be medium enterprises? Should we bail out larger enterprises and banks and so forth? So that was part of the great debate too. But by now we've sort of returned to the political normal. We are now discussing who's to be the candidate for the chancellery in the Christian Democratic Union. And yes, but of course all of this might be back in the fall when we expect the second wave.
So, but Anna, let me push you on that and then turn to Sewell in just a second with a viewer question, which is that obviously it's natural during the pandemic and given the social unrest, particularly in the US, that these issues are overshadowing a lot of other news. So in your respective roles at your papers, how do you make sure that other newsworthy items don't slip through the cracks with that incredible focus on the pandemic and on on social justice. And obviously the social justice issue is not as big in Germany, but I feel like the death of George Floyd that Sewell was talking about has created a new debate in Germany about people with diverse backgrounds and how they can be incorporated into society better. But what are some of the other issues that you feel you're focusing on, and how do you make sure that you don't lose track of them?
I actually think that looking back in the first weeks, we were very bad and focusing on anything but the pandemic, which of course is just that there weren't any news because it wasn't just Germany, it was many other governments in the world who had to focus on this one issue. Many of the events that would have driven news stories like big party conventions or on the international level, EU summits, meetings, international meetings, were just called off or reassigned to dealing with the pandemic. So this was really, for a few weeks, there was basically nothing else to talk about and nothing else to report. I think that now it was sort of it almost felt like a natural movement back to other issues. And of course, the events in the United States, the death of George Floyd had a large impact on Germany and on the debate here. And we've pretty much just imported that debate to Germany and have started to look at our police, structural racism in Germany, minorities and how they do, of course with a focus on people of color. And yes, that's like the second large debate that we've had since the beginning of the pandemic. And of course the two are intertwined because we don't know as well as in the United States how different groups are affected, which is because we don't have the data to relate to it. But of course there were instances, for example, when we had outbreaks too in great meat in the meat industry, where a lot of people from Bulgaria and Romania work, and those were moments when the two debates sort of fused, and we started to talk about neglected groups and stigmatization of certain groups, both by the pandemic and racism.
And Sewell, what about at the LA Times? How do you make sure that other newsworthy stories are reported on, despite the fact that the focus has been so much on the pandemic and on the social justice issues at the moment?
Yeah, I could speak to the whole organization, but let me start with my area, which is opinion journalism. Early on in the first few weeks of the pandemic, we recognized that this was really a nation-changing event. And we have launched a series called Reimagine California that asks our readers for their feedback about ways in which the pandemic has revealed underlying tensions or failures in society, in particular in public policy, and how we might address them. In short, we are trying to look at the short-term crisis as an avenue to examining longer-term problems. Let me give 3 or 4 examples. Los Angeles is a place, famously clogged with a lot of traffic. As we know, and the city has been moving toward a more green sustainability ethos, more bike lanes, more bus lanes, many more investments in public transit. That's one of the good stories of LA. But, a lot of people still feel trapped in their cars. Does this pandemic and the reduction in emissions and congestion that it affords give us a chance to rethink what a future, more sustainable Los Angeles will look like? Another world is the realm of housing affordability, however. There has been significant political will, for example, to temporarily house the homeless in hotels and motels. But some have asked, if we could do this in an emergency, why not in ordinary times? How did we allow so many street homeless to, live on the streets, many of them with mental illness or substance abuse issues? Why didn't we address that sooner? So we are undertaking a project where we're trying to look at a bunch of bigger themes through the prism of what the pandemic has taught us. Now, I will say that the George Floyd tragedy has in some ways changed things for us, because I think the magnitude of the crisis in America only got bigger. And if I can be frank, I think we really need to, at every level of our society, re-examine so many of our foundational assumptions. And if I can be frank, this is where I want to bring in Germany, because I believe that we must learn much more from other nations. I take away from the German experience this year in particular, a greater trust within civil society, less, I'm not saying there's none, but less misinformation and falsehoods, less of a kind of hyper-polarization, more reliance on kind of scientific expertise as a basis for decision making. And then finally, in the context of George Floyd, I have taken away a lot of I personally, but we've written about this as well, have taken away a lot of the discussions in which post-war Germany, engaged in this process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. And I know that process is complex, and I don't, especially as a foreigner, I don't want to make it seem like it was smooth and easy. But truly, we in America now are being asked to reckon with our past. What happened in this nation? What lack of reconciliation and lack of honest, clear, moral reckoning did we engage in? I say we as someone, whose parents have only been in America since the 1970s, but that's not really the point. To be American right now, I think, is to own up to our moral responsibility as a collective society and understand what this country did and didn't do. And so part of what I'm doing right now, Steve, as well, is helping the Los Angeles Times to come up with a reckoning of what we have done in Los Angeles and California, because historically, we were not a news organization that represented all the people of California. And we've gotten better, of course, and more than 36% of our staff are people of color, but there are still a lot of lingering issues and pain over what we did in the past. So I am helping to come up with an institutional reckoning over what the LA Times has been for California.
Well, and Sewell, I think that this issue of inclusiveness is one that's affecting a lot of media outlets across the US, around the world, but also other organizations at this time. And I think obviously part of it has to do with these multiple crises that are hitting at the same time. Not only do we find ourselves in the midst of a public health crisis and the economic implications of that as well, but the social justice crisis that's happening in parallel, I think, has created much greater awareness. And you brought up the word Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Obviously, Anna, coming to terms with one's past is nothing new for your paper and for Germany in general. Do you have any thoughts on this new phase of Vergangenheitsbewältigung and how that's being approached in Germany at the moment?
You mean that's related to the recent debate on racism in Germany?
Yes.
Or?
Yeah.
If you just trying to write a piece on that too, because I think on the one hand, I mean, I'm glad that the debate in the United States has started a debate on structural racism in Germany too, because I think there are many factors that are overlooked and undercovered. But at the same time, I feel uncomfortable with importing parts of the debate, because I think it makes us overlook even more aspects of what is wrong in Germany. Just to give one example is that now Germany in Berlin, we are looking again at our colonial history, the German colonial history, which is in comparison to how we have worked with the National Socialist period and the 30s and 40s is undercovered and under-researched, and we know few things about it. But while in the United States, I think it's very clear that slavery and the colonial period have an influence on racism today and on structural disadvantages for people of color in the United States, it's very unclear that in Germany this is the case. I mean, the immigrant population in Germany came here for the most part in the 50s and 60s, so this is really not a phenomenon of the colonial past. And the racism that they encounter is, I think, very much different from the racism that people of color or Asian Americans encounter in the United States. It's more sort of what I unaptly, without having a better word, sometimes called cultural racism. It's racism against, it's directed against the Muslim religion. It doesn't make it any better, of course, but I think in looking at the United States and the debate over there, we overlook the particularities of the things we need to improve in Germany itself. So this is why I'm a little uncomfortable with the current debate.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think an important element in all of this is trust. And so you already mentioned trust, trust in government, trust in media. That's something that you learned, you know, when you looked abroad. So the World Economic Forum recently reported that the media is playing such an important role in the COVID response as people try to stay informed about the pandemic. And we already talked about some of the challenges and the responsibility of media during this time. I'd be curious, what are the specific opportunities at this moment? And how is COVID-19 affecting the trust in journalism and the media? And how do you live up to an expectation maybe that's out there for, you know, for the media? So do you want to start?
Okay. Yeah, that's a profoundly important question. I think on the one hand, Katja, this has been a great moment for journalism in that we have seen skyrocketing numbers of vast expansion in our subscription numbers. People are, I think, flocking to news that they can trust. I think there is a too slow, but slow awareness that getting all of one's news from, you know, Facebook or Instagram or Google is not always the best way of having a rich news diet. I am certainly not saying the Los Angeles Times is the only credible source, but we're one of many, and we're one of the so-called legacy news sources, as they call it in the digital world, because we still have a print edition, of course. And I am agnostic. Trust can come from any medium whatsoever. What I think we're seeing in journalism right now is, however, a commitment to, you know, what are your principles as an organization? Do you have a standard of ethics that you publicize? Do you accept requests for correction and act on them? Do you have an independent representative or ombudsperson who can review the ethics within your organization? Who are your funders? How diverse is your staff? I think organizations that can answer those questions deserve more trust than organizations that refuse to. And I think that's one way to get out of the ideological, you know, blinders here. Look, Katja, I'm not going to lie. There are some very, very sad things going on in America. There was one peer-reviewed study suggesting that people who listened to, I believe it was Sean, I hope I'm not mistaking, and I'm not making this a partisan statement, but I believe some people who listened to Sean Hannity, if I'm not mistaken, had worse health outcomes than those who listened to Mr. Tucker Carlson within CNN. I believe, I'm pretty sure that that was shored up empirically. And to me, that was extremely depressing because, you know, there has been, let's face it, a kind of denialism, anti-science, anti-empiricism going on in some aspects of the news media landscape. That's the opposite of what we're about. My company is actually owned by a scientist. So we have expanded our scientific coverage. We stand by it and we're trying to affirm trust. But the trust problem in America is a very thorny one. As you all know, trust in America has been declining for something like 4 decades. And unfortunately, the decline of trust is pretty severe across institutions. Lower trust in government, lower trust in journalism, even lower trust in military, judiciary, and institutions of religion and faith. Now, I don't think that that erosion of trust is irreversible, but it has to be acknowledged, and it will take the whole of our society's efforts to rebuild that sense of trust. And, you know, I believe Chancellor Merkel recently said that she said something about trust. She said something about how, you know, our society has benefited, it has endured because we trust each other, something like that. Unfortunately, I don't believe that that is a current statement that President Trump could make. And I don't say that in any partisan fashion. I just feel that unfortunately, he has not been someone who's been able to build up trust, partly because of his fondness for misinformation and his fondness for divisiveness. I think trust has to be rebuilt from the ground up in America. I think the whole civil society has been shaken by these traumas of the last few months. We know that when you ask Americans, do they trust Congress, they say no. When you ask them, do they trust their individual member of Congress, they're more willing to say, oh, I still trust. Same thing in the media. People don't trust the media, but when you ask them, do they trust their local newspaper, they often say, yeah, I do trust. So I think if we're going to help to restore trust in the US, the local and the state level has to be a big part of rebuilding.
I guess, Anna, the same question to you. I mean, we've just heard Sewell talk a little bit about a crisis in confidence, if you will, in democratic institutions and practices, but also in some media outlets. Do you see the same thing playing out in Germany?
I mean, there are very few surveys. My first impression just from interacting with readers was that, as I said in the very beginning, there was very much positive feedback from readers. I mean, usually people just write to you when they're not content with what you've written, or they found an error in one of your pieces, and now people started to write to us, saying thank you for the good work you do. We trust in the information you give us. Thanks for explaining the coronavirus to us. So that was very positive, and I think that some of the first surveys that we have in Germany, one from the University of Freiburg, showed that the traditional media were able to build trust during the crisis. The traditional media being television, the radio stations, the public radio stations and television stations in Germany, and also the newspapers and their online sites. But I think that on a smaller scale, or in a less dramatic way, we do see the same split as in the United States here in Germany too. We do see that the voters of the AfD, the Alternative for Germany Party, do trust less in the traditional media. They get their information more frequently from social media platforms, from YouTube or alternative channels, where the sources are less clear, and where conspiracy theories are not as frequently checked. And we do see, we've also had one important study from the Allensbach Institute on conspiracy theories in general, and how often people adhere to such theories, and that too shows that in general the general public seems to be quite immune to those theories, that a large majority of the German population does not believe in such ideas, but that among the voters from the Alternative for Germany, it's really the other way around. So we do have a portion of the population, about 10 to 20%, those who vote for this party. We seem to lose, and that even during this crisis we couldn't win back for the information that we as the traditional media supply.
Yes, thank you so much. And just on this issue of trust, I would just like to know, you know, to me it seems like that the media is increasingly blamed for certain developments. You know, whenever there's bad news, it's partly also because of the media reporting, you know, the bad news, or doing something that leads to the bad news. So in this pandemic, do you observe that the media is used as a scapegoat for mismanagement or for negative developments? And if you do so, how do you break through this maybe ideological lens that's clusters sort of our view? And also, do you feel a certain pressure to report in a certain way, to report in a maybe optimistic or positive way, to feed into a certain narrative? So do you want to take this
Yeah.
on?
Yeah, I have pretty strong feelings on that. Look, I think to answer your first question, I wish I didn't have to say this, but I think the pressure is coming from a very small number of sources, including President Trump, who continues to call the press the enemies of the people. No, look, I work at the Los Angeles Times. To my understanding, he has not directly criticized us. He has criticized my former colleagues at the New York Times, the Washington Post, and people I know at CNN. I have no doubt that many followers of President Trump feel that the mainstream media is too harsh on him, and I am open to their point of view. But I don't think that a use of a term, popularized by Lenin, like enemies of the people, that is not very helpful. And not only is it not very helpful, but to my ears, at a time of rising attacks against journalists worldwide, and I'm especially talking about outside the West. I'm talking about in countries like Philippines, where our colleague Maria Ressa is facing criminal charges. I'm talking about countries like Turkey and like Mexico, where journalists are routinely imprisoned or killed. I'm talking about journalists attempting to cover Hong Kong, where the new Chinese law has made that much harder. This is a time of great challenge for press freedom. And I would urge anyone in power to, look, we're the media. We have a lot of power and privilege in that we control printing, digital and physical printing presses. We must use that power responsibly and in a balanced and fair way. Now, that gets to the second part of your question about opinions. I agree that if journalists have one bias, I would argue it is not necessarily, in most cases, an ideological bias, but we are biased toward the short term. I truly am, because the definition of what's new is news is something that's new. We have done a not as good a job as journalists, in my view, at explaining the longer term and structural things that are going on. Now, we alone can't do it. The school system has to help, news literacy has to help, but we must do a better job of contextualizing problems. That way, that can open the door to understanding what possible solutions are. And so I'm trying to direct our opinion team toward a team that goes away from simply diagnosing problems to also talking to experts and understanding what possible solutions are. Because I think the more fair criticism of journalism is not that we're enemies of the people. My gosh, that comment really depresses me, frankly. I think the more fair criticism is, we are good at pointing out society's ills. Can we now play a part in fixing them? Not by ourselves, running social programs. I don't think that's what's called for, but rather by convening conversations, by helping people, I use our opinion pages to bridge ideological divides, invite vigorous but also civil debate, and try to get in a variety of perspectives and help our readers understand the trade-offs involved when you make a difficult policy decision, like the decision to close schools. And I think the more that we can explain and contextualize, we're not just contributing to the information bubbles and the hyperpolarization that are threatening the integrity of our society. We must avoid that.
Thank you, Sewell. I'd like to come to you, Anna, because obviously there are similar kinds of ideological questions in the media landscape in Germany. And when I think about the jobs that each of you perform in your role managing the editorial pages of your respective newspapers, you have a certain responsibility to reflect opinion, but you also have the ability to shape opinion. And so coming back to Katja's question about sort of the ideological lens that you might look through, how do you try to stay neutral and make sure that there's a wide range of perspectives that are presented?
I think it's sometimes quite difficult. Do you mean just with regard to the pandemic, or more?
I think more in general right now.
Well, I think because one thing I do at my newspaper is my department is also responsible for a page and a website called Causa, which is the website for debate. And we've we have it for 3 or 4 years now, and the idea was to have more controversy, to also allow for more controversial opinions from the further right and left sides of the spectrum, because we felt that sometimes the debate in Germany is too much just in the middle, and then the argument that populists often use, that there is like a mainstreaming of opinion. I'm not saying it's true, but of course it is the case that for a while in Germany it was hard to place certain opinions in the public. But at the beginning, like 4 years ago, we sometimes allowed for Alternative for Germany policymakers to place op-eds on the site. But I think by now we almost always decide against it, because the party has taken a direction that's only going to the extreme far right. It is now being, or parts of the party are now being observed by the German Interior Secret Services and other, and by the police. The utterances of many prominent policymakers have been so inhumane that we keep rejecting those pieces. So the idea of including this party and including such opinions in the mainstream debate is in a way failed. So yes, we don't do that anymore. But I think also during the Corona crisis, we've had many debates within the editorial staff of the Tagesspiegel, like what opinions should we place? One example is a great controversy around one prominent epidemiologist in Germany, Christian Drosten, the German Anthony Fauci. He had a podcast. He became a very prominent figure, and he was openly attacked by the far right in Germany, as well as the tabloid newspaper Bild Zeitung. And we've often had debates and what arguments or how should we report on the debate around this personality? Are we just amplifying the debate if we report on it? At the same time, of course, we do. It's sort of our responsibility as a news organization too, to report on criticism. So there were quite some fierce debates within the Tagesspiegel too.
Thank you, Anna. I'd like to switch gears a little bit, and I'll stick with you, Anna, first, and then come to you, Sewell, and talk a little bit about the economics of all of this. Many media outlets are making their coverage of the Corona crisis available free of charge. This has been, a time when, ads have gone down because the economy is slowing down, making it especially hard for local papers that are struggling. So ironically, at a time when people are in search of reliable information about the virus, layoffs, cutbacks, furloughs, and closures in newsrooms, as well as the drop in advertising revenue, have forced a number of particularly local papers to cut back or even fold. And I guess the question I have for each of you is, do you think that most media outlets, particularly local media outlets, will make it through this crisis?
Well, I honestly don't know. I think I can tell from my newspaper that, of course, the cuts we think to our revenues were very harsh. We have like 3 pillars of revenues at the Tagesspiegel, and I think it's not unusual for a German newspaper, which the first of which is subscription from the old printed newspaper. We don't have a digital. We just introduced a digital subscription model 2 weeks ago, so we didn't have it in the beginning of the crisis and couldn't really profit from the increased interest in the content we were offering to our readers. This one is fairly stable, and I think that's a great advantage for German newspapers, that most of them can rely on that chunk of revenue, because subscribers to German newspapers are usually older and they're very loyal, and most of them have stayed with us for decades, and they won't cancel their subscription just because they maybe just because there's a dent in the economic situation. The second and third pillar are problem, which is the advertisement revenues, and then we and many newspapers and many other newspapers do so too in Germany. We make quite a bit of money with organizing events, and we at Tagesspiegel we have a large department that organizes events that sometimes have like 7-digit revenues. It's about 100 people who work there, and this is of course something that's very challenging now to find virtual formats that work, virtual formats that people are already also willing to pay for. So I guess it depends how the economic situation evolves. So we are currently hoping, and the Minister of the Economy has just said so yesterday, that maybe the dent is just maybe very brief, and that we've seen the worst of it, and that the economy in Germany may recover in the fourth quarter. So then I would say that we won't see any newspapers closing in Germany. But of course, if we have a second wave and there has to be another lockdown and the economy goes back down again, that will certainly affect some of the struggling newspapers.
Sewell, you've written a couple of articles about the fate of local media outlets in the US. Can you share with us some of your thoughts about where things are going? But I'd also like to fold in a viewer question, which is, given your experience both on the East Coast and now on the West Coast in the media landscape, do you see any big differences between what's going on the coasts, but also what's going on in the heartland?
Sure. Well, what Anna says is very resonant for me. You know, at the Los Angeles Times, we for the first time have more digital subscribers than print subscribers. Now, I want to be clear, if you subscribe to the physical newspaper, you still get a digital subscription accompanying it, 2 for 1. But the number of digital-only subscribers is now greater than the number of print subscribers. So that is kind of a sea change for us, and it is a necessary change. Unfortunately, the revenues that we make from the digital subscriptions, because they cost less, is still less than the revenue we make from the physical subscriptions. So that's on the circulation side. On the advertising side, advertising has just been completely decimated. As you can imagine, you know, Los Angeles is the home of Hollywood. Normally there would be a lot of ads about summer blockbusters or the latest action film or what have you. Those ads, of course, are gone. So there's and on the digital side of advertising, you know, 2/3 of digital ads in America, the revenue goes to 2 companies alone, Google and Facebook. So there really is, you know, it's a somewhat bleak economic picture. I think our hope is certainly that we deliver enough value to readers that we can continue to drive up the number of digital subscriptions. It's currently about 250,000, but we really need several times that. You know, in comparison, there are 3 really national news organizations in America that were newspapers that have really achieved digital liftoff or velocity: the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. And they've all done so through different ways, but I think the commonality among them, along with very, very high quality, has been a lot of investment in technology, and also the fact that they're frankly reaching a kind of more global and more elite audience. You know, I've worked at the New York Times for 14 years and at the Washington Post for 4 years before that. I know that, you know, decision makers, certainly in Washington and the European capitals, you know, need these very, very kind of high end prestige internationally recognized news outlets. The problem, as I see it, and I discussed this actually with a group of German editors when they were visiting Los Angeles last fall is you really are seeing the emergence of so-called news deserts in places that are outside of the major cities. I believe these German editors were telling me about places in the former East, places that are far, far from the major economic centers like Berlin, Hamburg, Munich, and Frankfurt. And you're seeing that in America as well. You're seeing, there was a major study that found that thousands of newspapers have closed in the United States. Newspaper employment has dropped by half. And where that has been most experienced and seen is in places like the state capitals and the local governments. We are not only such a geographically vast country, but we have so many layers of government. Did you know, for example, that there are 18,000 police agencies just in the United States? So they all have the different protocols for use of force. When you talk about police reform in America, you're also talking about how to get information in a reliable and uniform fashion from 18,000 agencies. And how, so, there's this problem of fragmentation. I worry about that a lot because numerous studies have shown that the biggest loss in news in America right now is news about the state and local level. The areas where actually people are willing, as I said earlier, to be more trusting. If people don't know with what the local water district, school district, Parks and Recreation Department, what their local communities are doing with their taxpayer dollars, and they're only watching Fox or getting their news from Facebook, we've got real problems. Many of these communities where the news deserts are emerging happen to be actually lower income and more conservative parts of the country. And that worries me a lot because, as I said earlier, I think trust has to be rebuilt from the bottom. And that includes, trusting your local officials, your local school board, understanding their activities. And local news in America has traditionally really been the ones playing that watchdog role. Even with, 1,800 journalists, the New York Times can't possibly do that. We have something like 30,000 local governments in America. There, you would need a scale much, much larger than the New York Times to begin to kind of cover things at a local level. So I'm sorry for the long answer, but that's what worries me.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And just looking at the time, I think we need to come to a close. But I'd like to ask you both about the focus in newsrooms moving forward. And these are two viewer questions. So maybe you can just close with the question: will the pandemic and George Floyd cast a lasting spotlight on social reforms, or will it fade away? With other words, will it last long enough to make a change? And then Anna, the other question is, with the reporting on the raging pandemic and on everyone's concern, how do you avoid maybe a saturation and numbing to the problem? Over-reporting. How do you keep the interest that's there in line with what people can actually consume and process? So Sewell, maybe you want to start, and then Anna,
I'll keep it brief. I'll keep it brief. It's very difficult for journalists to make predictions. I happen to think that this is the most momentous and in some ways somber and in some ways tragic year in America since 1968. And I think that this is a year that we will be talking about for quite some time. I don't think I think we'll be continuing to write about it for some time. What the long-term political consequences will be, hard to tell.
I'm sorry, again, the audio was so bad that I'm not sure I got the question all right.
So Anna, let me sort of rephrase it. And I guess the question for you is whether the pandemic will continue to stay front and center, or whether over-reporting will sort of make people lose interest in this and numb viewers and readers to what is still a raging crisis.
I think we have the luxury these days to know very well what our readers are interested in, because we have all the analytics dashboards. We can look into and see what pieces the readers like best on a certain day, how long they kept on reading, how much they engaged, how often they shared a certain piece. So I think we can say that even though Germany has pretty much returned to normal, besides wearing masks in public and keeping the 1.5 meters distance to your fellow citizens, there are very few restrictions in public life, so life feels normal again, and this, of course, is reflected in what our readers are interested in. It's both that they seem to consume less news again. At the height of the pandemic, we actually doubled the number of unique users that visit our website every day, and it's now not down to before the crisis, but it's now down to, I think before the crisis we had like 7 million unique users a month, and now we are at 11. At the height of the crisis we were at 15 or even 16 million a month in March and April. Corona is still a big issue for many people. We have 2 maps where you can look up sort of your daily Corona figures, breaking it down to local communities in Germany is one map, and the other is the international figures, and those are still really well frequented. They're one of the most visited items on our website, so it's still there. People seem to they still want to have an overview of where the pandemic is at, but we also see that they take a great interest in all other areas of life. Again, like one of the best read pieces in the past days, and this is very comforting in a way, was a piece on new Gregorian restaurants in Berlin, and what are the best ones, and those actually get us a lot of subscriptions. So I think people are focusing on the pleasures of life again too, and like a regular politics, and that's what we report on more now. So of course we adapt to what our readers want to know.
Well, Anna Sauerbrey and Sewell Chan, I want to thank you both for spending this hour with us, which really has passed, it feels, in just a few minutes. This has been such a insightful and lively discussion, and Katja and I have enjoyed it immensely. On behalf of both 1014 and the American Council on Germany, I want to thank you both for the opportunity to speak with us today. In many senses, I feel like we're skimming the surface, and I hope that we'll have the opportunity to come back and continue this conversation at some point later in the year. And to our viewers, I want to thank all of you for joining us and for participating with some great questions again this time.
After 10 episodes, it's time to take a summer break, but we look forward to seeing you all again in September. So stay well, everyone, and thank you.